Welcome back. My name's MyLinda Butterworth, and we're going to continue reading The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by L. Frank Baum. Today, we begin with Chapter 5, How Bessie Blitzen Came to the Laughing Valley. One day, as Claus sat before his door to enjoy the sunshine while he busied carving the head and horns of a toy deer, he looked up and discovered a glittering cavalcade of horsemen approaching through the valley. When they drew near, he saw that the band consisted of a score of men-at-arms clad in bright armor and bearing in their hands spears and battle-axes. In front of those rode little Bessie Blitzen, the pretty daughter of that proud Lord of Lords who had once driven Claus from his palace. Her palfrey was pure white in bridle, covered with glittering gems, and its saddle draped with a cloth of gold, richly embroidered. The soldiers were sent to protect her from harm while she journeyed. Claus was surprised, but he continued to whittle and to sing until the cavalcade drew up before him. Then the little girl leaned over the neck of her palfrey and said, "Please, Mr. Claus, I want a toy." Her voice was so pleading that Claus jumped up at once and stood beside her, but he was puzzled how to answer her request. "You are a rich lord's daughter," said he, "and have all that you desire." "Except toys," added Bessie. "There are no toys in all the world but yours." "And I make them for poor children who have nothing to amuse themselves," continued Claus. "Do poor children love to play with toys more than rich ones?" asked Bessie. "I suppose not," Claus said thoughtfully. "Am I to blame because my father is a lord? Must I be denied the pretty toys I long for because the other children are poorer than I am?" she inquired earnestly. "I'm afraid you must, dear," he answered, "for the poor have nothing else with which to amuse himself. You have your pony to ride, your servants to wait on you, and every comfort that money can buy." "But I want toys," cried Bessie, wiping away the tears that forced themselves into her eyes. "If I cannot have them, I shall be very unhappy." Claus was troubled, for her grief recalled to him the thought that his desire was to make children happy, without regard to their condition in life. Yet while so many poor children were clamoring for his toys, he could not bear to give one of them to Bessie Blitzen, who had so many already to make her happy. "Listen, my child," he said gently. "All the toys I am making are promised to others, but the next shall be yours, since your heart so longs for it. Come to me again in 2 days, and it shall be ready for you." Bessie cried with delight, and leaning over her pony's neck, she kissed Claus prettily upon his forehead. Then, calling to her men-at-arms, she rode gaily away, leaving Claus to resume his work. "If I am to supply the rich children as well as the poor ones," he thought, "I shall not have a spare moment in the whole year. But is it right that I should give to the rich? Surely I must go to Necile and talk with her about this matter." So when he had finished the toy deer, which was very like a deer he had known in the forest glades, he walked into Bercy and made his way to the bower of the beautiful nymph Necile, who had been his foster mother. She greeted him tenderly and lovingly, listening with interest to the story of the visit of Bessie Blitzen. "And now tell me," said he, "shall I give toys to the rich children?" "We of the forest know nothing of riches," she replied. "It seems to me that one child is like another child, since they all are made of the same clay, and that riches are like a gown, which may be put on or taken away, leaving the child unchanged. But the fairies are guardians of mankind, and know mortal children better than I. Let me call the fairy mother." This was done. The queen of the fairies sat beside them and heard Claus relate his reason for thinking the rich children should get along without toys, and also what the nymph had said. "Nacelle is right," declared the queen, "for whether it be rich or poor, a child's longing for pretty playthings are but natural. Rich Bessie's heart may suffer as much grief as poor Marie's. She can be just as lonely and discontented, and just as gay and happy. I think, friend Claus, it is your duty to make all little ones glad, whether the chance be to live in palaces or in cottages." "Your words are wise, fair queen," replied Claus, "and my heart tells me they are just and they are wise. Hereafter, all children may claim my services." Then he bowed before the gracious fairy and, kissing Nacile's red lips, went back into his valley. At the brook he stopped to drink, and afterwards he sat on the bank and took a piece of moist clay in his hands while he thought what kind of toy he should make for Bessie Blitzen. He did not notice that his fingers were working the clay into shape until, glancing downward, he found he had unconsciously formed a head that bore a slight resemblance to that of the nymph Nacile. At once he became interested. Gathering more of the clay from the bank, he carried it to his house. Then, with the aid of his knife and a bit of wood, he succeeded in working the clay into the image of a toy nymph. With skillful strokes, he formed long, wavy hair on the head, and covering the body with a gown of oak leaves, while the 2 feet sticking out of the bottom of the gown were clad in sandals. But the clay was soft, and Claus found he must handle it gently to avoid ruining his pretty work. Perhaps the ray of the sun will draw out the moisture and cause the clay to become hard, he thought. So he laid the image out on a flat board and placed it in the glare of the sun. This done, he went to his bench and began painting the toy deer, and soon he became so interested in the work that he forgot about the clay nymph. But next morning, happening to notice it lay out on the board, he found the sun had baked it to the hardness of a stone, and it was strong enough to be safely handled. Claus now painted the nymph with great care in the likeness of Nacile, giving it deep blue eyes, white teeth, rosy lips, and ruddy brown hair. The gown he colored oak leaf green, and when the paint was dry, Claus himself was charmed with the new toy. Of course, it was not nearly as lovely as the real Nacile, but considering the material of which he made it, Claus thought it was very beautiful. When Bessie, riding upon her pretty white palfrey, came to his dwelling the next day, Claus presented her with the new toy. The little girl's eyes were brighter than ever before, and she examined the pretty image, and she loved it at once, and he held it close to her heart as a mother does a child. "What is it called, Claus?" she asked. Now, Claus knew that nymphs do not like to be spoken of by mortals, so he could not tell Bessie that it was in the image of Nacile that had been taken from. But as it was a new toy, he searched his mind for a name to call it, and the first word he thought of would do very well. "I call it a dolly, my dear," he said to Bessie. "I shall call the dolly my baby," returned Bessie, kissing it fondly, "and I shall tend it and care it for it just as nurse cares for me. Thank you very much, Claus. Your gift has made me happier than I have ever been before." Then she rode away, hugging the toy in her arms, and Claus, seeing her delight, thought he would make another dolly, better and more natural than the first. He brought more clay from the brook, and remembering that Bessie had called the dolly her baby, he resolved to form this one in the image of a baby. That was no difficult task to the clever workman, and soon the baby doll was lying on the board and placed in the sun to dry. Then when the clay was left, he began to make an image of Bessie Blitzen herself. This was not so easy, for he found he could not make the silken robe of the Lord's daughter out of the common clay. So he called the fairies to his aid and asked them to bring him colored silks with which to make a real dress for the clay image. The fairies set off at once on their errand, and before nightfall they returned with a generous supply of silk and laces and golden threads. Claus now became impatient to complete his new dolly, and instead of waiting for the next day's sun, he placed the clay image upon his hearth and covered it over with glowing coals. By morning, when he drew the dolly from the ashes, it had baked as hard as it had been the same day out in the full sun. Now, our Claus became a dressmaker as well as a toy maker. He cut the lavender silk and neatly sewed it into a beautiful gown that just fit his new dolly. And he put a lace collar around its neck and pink silk shoes on its feet. The natural color of baked clay is a light gray, but Claus painted the face to resemble the color of flesh, and he gave the dolly Bessie's brown eyes and golden hair and 2 rosy cheeks. It was really a beautiful thing to look upon, and sure to bring to some childish hearts much joy. When Claus was admiring it, he heard a knock at her door, and little Marie entered. Her face was sad, and her eyes red with continual weeping. "Why, what was to grieve you, my dear?" asked Claus, taking the child in his arm. I broke my tat," sobbed Marie. "How?" he inquired, his eyes twinkling. I dropped him and broke off his tail, and then I dropped him and I broke off his ear, and now he's all spoilt." Claus laughed. "Never mind, Marie, dear. How would you like this new dolly instead of a cat?" Marie looked at the silk-robed dolly, and her eyes grew big with astonishment. "Oh, thou!" she cried, clapping her small hands together with rapture. "Can I have the beautiful lady?" "Do you like it?" he asked. "I love it," she said. "It's better than tats." "Then take it, dearie, and be careful not to break it." Marie took the dolly in her arms with joy which was almost reverent, and her face dimpled with smiles as she started along the path home. Chapter 6. The Wickedness of the Awgwas. I must tell you something about the Aguas, the terrible race of creatures which caused our good Claus so much trouble and nearly succeeded in robbing the children of the world of their earliest and best friend. I do not like to mention the Awgwas, but they are part of his history and cannot be ignored. They were neither mortals nor immortals, but stood midway between those classes of beings. The Awgwas were invisible to ordinary people, but not to immortals. They could pass swiftly through the air from one part of the world to another, and had the power of influencing the minds of human beings to do wicked things. They were of a gigantic stature, and had coarse, scowling countenances, which showed plainly their hatred of all mankind. They possessed no conscience whatever, and delighted only in evil deeds. Their homes were in rocky, mountainous places, from whence they sallied forth to accomplish their wicked purposes. The one of their number that could think of the most horrible deeds for them to do was always elected the king Aguas, and all the race obeyed his orders. Sometimes these creatures lived to become 100 years old, but usually they fought so fiercely among themselves that they were destroyed in combat, and when they died, that was the end of them. Mortals were powerless to harm them, and the immortals shuddered when the Awgwas were mentioned, and always avoided them. So they flourished for many years unopposed, and accomplished much evil. I am glad to assure you that these vile creatures have long since perished and passed from the earth. But in the days when Claus was making his first toys, they were numerous and a powerful tribe. One of the principal sports of the Awgwas was to inspire angry passions in the hearts of little children, so that they quarreled and fought with one another. They would tempt boys to eat unripe fruit, and then delight in the pains they suffered. They urged little girls to disobey their parents, and then would laugh when the children were punished. I do not know what causes a child to be naughty in these days, but when the Awgwas were on earth, naughty children were usually under their influence. Now, when Claus began to make children happy, he kept them out of the power of the Awgwas. For children possessing such lovely playthings as they gave them had no wish to do anything evil, and the Awgwas were thrust into their minds. Therefore, one year, when the wicked tribe was to elect a new king, they chose an Awgwa who proposed to destroy Claus and take away from him the children. There are, as you know, few naughty children in the world since Claus came to the Laughing Valley and began to make all those toys, said the king, as he squatted upon a rock and looked around at the scowling faces of his people. Why, Bessie Blitzen has not stamped her foot once this month, nor has Mary's brother slapped his sister's face or thrown the puppy into the rain barrel. Little Weekum took his bath last night without screaming or struggling because his mother had promised that she would take away his toy cat if he did. Such a condition of affairs is awful for any Awgwa to think of, and the only way we can direct the naughty actions of children is to take the person Claus away from them. Good, good, cried the big Awgwas in a chorus, and they clapped their hands and applauded the speech of the king. But what shall we do? Asked one of the creatures. I have a plan, replied the wicked king, and what his plan was, you will soon discover. That night, Claus went to bed feeling very happy, for he had completed no less than 4 pretty toys during the day, and they were sure, he thought, to make the 4 little children happy. But while he slept, the band of invisible Awgwas surrounded his bed, bound him with stout cords, and then flew away with him to the middle of the dark forest in far-off Ethop, where they laid him down and left him. When morning came, Claus found himself thousands of miles from any human beings, a prisoner in the wild jungle of an unknown land. From the limb of a tree above his head swayed a huge python, one of those reptiles that are able to crush a man's bones with his coils. A few yards away crouched a savage panther, its glaring eyes fixed full on the helpless Claus. One of these monstrous spotted spiders, whose sting is death, crept steadily toward him over the matted leaves, which shriveled and turned black at their very touch. But Claus had been reared in Berzi and was not afraid. Come to me, you nooks of the forest, he cried, and gave the low, peculiar whistle that nooks knew. Now the panther, which was about to spring upon its victim, turned and slunk away. The python swung itself into the tree and disappeared among the leaves, and the spider stopped short in its advance and hid beside a rotting log. Claus had no time to notice them, for he was surrounded by a band of harsh-featured nooks, more crooked and deformed in appearance than any he had ever seen. Who are you that called us? Demanded one in a gruff voice. The friend of your brothers in Berzi, answered Claus. I have been brought here by my enemies, the Awgwas, and left to perish miserably, yet now I implore your help to release me and to send me home again. Have you the sign? Said one of them. Yes, said Claus. They cut his bonds, and with his free arms he made the secret sign of the nooks. Instantly they assisted him to stand upon his feet, and they brought him food and drink to strengthen him. Our brothers of Berzi make queer friends, grumbled an ancient nook, whose flowing beard was pure white. But he who knows our secret sign and signal is entitled to our help, whoever he may be. Close your eyes, stranger, and we will conduct you to your home. Where shall we seek it? "'Tis in the Laughing Valley," answered Claus, shutting his eyes. "There is but one Laughing Valley in the known world, as we cannot go astray," remarked the Knook. As he spoke, the sound of his voice seemed to die away, so Claus opened his eyes to see what caused the change. To his astonishment, he found himself seated on the bench by his own door, with the Laughing Valley spread out before him. That day he visited the wood nymphs and related his adventure to Queen Zurline and to Necile. "The Awgwas have become your enemies," said the lovely queen thoughtfully, "so we must do all we can protect you from their powers." "It was cowardly to bind him while he slept," replied Necile with indignation. "The evil ones are ever cowardly," answered Zurline, "but our friend's slumber shall not be disturbed again." The queen herself came to the dwelling of Claus that evening and placed her seal on every door and window to keep the Awgwas out. And under the seal of Queen Zurline was placed the seal of the fairies, and the seal of the Ryls, and the seal of the Knooks, that the charms might become more powerful. And Claus carried his toys to the children again and made many more of them happy. You may guess how angry the King Awgwas was and his fierce band were when they found out that Claus had escaped the forest of Aethop. They raged madly for a whole week, and then held another meeting among the rocks. "It is useless to carry him where the Knooks reign," and the king said, "for they have his protection. So let us cast him into a cave of his own mountain, where he will surely perish." This was promptly agreed to, and the wicked band set out that night to seize Claus. But they found this dwelling guarded by the seals of the immortals, and were obliged to go away, baffled and disappointed. "Never mind," said the king. "He does not sleep always." Next day, as Claus traveled to the village across the plain, where he intended to present a toy squirrel to a lame boy, he was suddenly set upon by the Awgwas, who seized him and carried him away to the mountains. There they thrust him within a deep cavern and rolled many huge stones against the entrance to prevent his escape. Deprived thus of light and food and little air to breathe, our Claus was indeed in a pitiful plight. But he spoke the mystic words of the fairies, which always commanded their free aid, and they came to his rescue and transported him back to the valley in the twinkling of an eye. Thus the Awgwas discovered they might not destroy one who earned the friendship of the immortals. So the evil band sought other ways of keeping Claus from bringing happiness to children and so making them obedient. Whenever Claus set out to carry his toys to the little ones, an Awgwa, who had been set to watch his movements, sprang upon him and snatched the toys from his grasp, and the children were no more disappointed than was Claus when he was obliged to return home, very unhappy. Still he persevered and made many toys for his little friends, and started with them for the villages, and always the Awgwas robbed him as soon as he left the valley. They threw the stolen playthings into one of their lonely caverns, and quite a heap of toys accumulated before Claus became discouraged and gave up all attempts to leave the valley. Then children began coming to him, since they found he did not go to them. But the wicked Awgwas flew around them and caused their steps to stray and the paths to become crooked, so never a little one could find their way to the Laughing Valley. Lonely days now flew upon Claus, for he was denied the pleasure of bringing happiness to the children whom he learned to love. Yet he bore up bravely, for he thought surely the time would come when the Awgwas would abandon their evil designs to injure him. He devoted all his hours to toy making, and when one plaything had been completed, he stood it on a shelf he had built for that very purpose. When the shelf became filled with rows of toys, he made another one and filled that also. so that in time he had many shelves filled with gay and beautiful toys representing horses and dogs and cats and elephants, lambs and rabbits and deers, as well as pretty dolls of all sizes and balls and marbles of baked clay painted in gay colors. Often as he glanced at this array of childish treasures, the heart of good Claus became sad. So greatly did he long to carry the toys to his children, and at last, because he could bear it no longer, he ventured to go to see the great Auk, to whom he told his story of the persecution by the Awgwas, and begged the master woodkeeper to assist him. And there we end our tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more stories about the adventures of Santa Claus. We'll see you soon. Bye for now.